Okay, so I'm going to show you a few of the basic stitches that I use to make pretty much every design. This is printed on the same stabilizer paper that your stencil is printed on. So I'm just going to take it off of the backing and smooth it down. So when you do this on whatever you want to stitch on, you can just choose the location, just kind of smooth it down. You can like take it up if it's, you know, not centered or whatever, take it up and put it down one more time. Just make sure that's nice and secure, and then you'll hoop your design. I'm gonna try to get everything I can in here if possible. Oh yeah, that will fit. And you want it to be tight, but not, you don't want to overstretch it. Okay, so typically this should cover pretty much any design. So you can choose what stitch you typically do. For something like this, especially because this is a more intricate design, it just has more lines to it, I probably will just do a back stitch. If you're wanting to fill something in, like I would probably fill in this rainbow with a chain stitch. Or, you know, maybe you just want the lines thicker. That also works for a chain stitch. So I'll show you a back stitch on a design, a back stitch on a name. Most of my designs do have names with them. Chain stitch and French knots for the clouds. A satin stitch is sometimes a good choice. And then a whipped back stitch. So I'll show you that too. So like I said, really the choice is yours on what stitch you'd like to choose, but these are some of my go-tos. And so hopefully just kind of seeing the overview and seeing how to do it, you can choose what would look best for whatever you're stitching. Okay, so I'm going to start by threading my needle, but before that, to talk about embroidery floss. So if you ordered floss with a kit at all, I sent you DMC floss. It's a brand I use, I recommend. But all embroidery floss has 6 strands. If you can see it, they're all kind of like woven into each other. And I like to separate them. Really, my go-to is to use 3 strands. So I separate it 3 and 3. And this is just going to make the line not quite as thick. But it'll still be noticeable. So that is my go-to. Like I said, you can do all 6 stitch strands. You can do any number of strands. The more you use, the thicker your line will be. And it could be like this font would still work with 6 strands, but some of them, if the letters are smaller together, 6 strands might be a little too thick and would be hard to, it'd be too bold. So you wouldn't necessarily see it very well and very clearly. So I have 3 strands of embroidery floss here. I'm going to run it through my needle and I'll show you how I do my knots. So I'm just gonna put it right through there. Okay. So I put it down where I have a little bit of a tail. I'm going to the end of my thread. This is called a quilter's knot. You absolutely can just do a regular double knot at the end. But how I do it is I put the thread up against my needle and I'm holding it between my index finger and my thumb. And I'm wrapping it around 3 times. It's not super tight, it's just wrapped around. And then I'm going to hold that in between my index finger and my thumb and pull down. So I can feel where I wrapped and it's pulling all the way down, and then I have a little knot. So to me, that's just the easiest. It's been the most consistent, so that's what I use. But again, you can do anything. Okay, let's start with the back stitch. And so we're going to start over here on the turkey. So wanted to show you this because I'm going to be alternating colors, and I'm not going to do the whole turkey, but just to show you, you know, how the different colors could work together. We'll start over here at this feather. So I'm going to bring my needle and I'm going to come up from behind at where the line starts, where I want this color to begin. So I'm going to come up right there and pull it through. And then I'll do a down stitch probably about this far of a distance. And I'll go right down. The thing that is going to make it look the cleanest, most consistent is to keep your stitches the same length. And so what you do now is you come right back up and it's about the same size distance. It does not have to be perfect, but you come right back up. And then I'm going to go backwards, hence the back stitch, and go right back in the same exact hole I just came up. That's the other thing that kind of keeps it looking as clean as possible. So I chose this design to show you kind of a straight line and a curve because I know all designs are going to have a little bit of both. So in a curve, one thing that will make it look cleaner is to have smaller stitches and or to make sure that you kind of hit and go to a down stitch right here where you want to be turning directions. So what I'm going to do is come up right here in the middle. And so as you can see, I mean, that's a little bit smaller of a stitch than right here. Again, it doesn't have to be perfect. Like, this is a handmade product. And so I think as long as it's kind of symmetrical, it looks good. And so since this is on either side of this curve, I'll do another small stitch right here to make sure that that curve is clean. And then I'll do kind of back to my normal size, go up, and I'm going right back down the same hole and go up and right back down the same hole. Okay, and with the colors that I've chosen, what I'd like to do is have a yellow feather, a red feather, like a blue feather, a yellow feather, blue, you know, just alternating them. So I am going to go ahead and I'm on the back right here. I'm going to just go ahead and jump over here. I think it'll be totally fine. There'll be enough stitches between here and there to kind of tack it down. So I'm going to come up and down and just kind of continue this color in the design. Up and down. Again, kind of keeping it consistent as best you can. This one looks like I won't have to change the length of my stitch and I'll be able to hit it right in the middle. So that'll be perfect. I'm going to go ahead and do 2. Finish off this feather. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and show you how to tie off and change to a different color. So when I'm finished with the thread color, I do just typically do a simple double knot. And so I wrap the thread around my finger and run the needle underneath that loop I just created, pull it tight, and then I use my finger to kind of guide it up against the fabric as close as you can. And then I'll tie it again. And to make the back look as clean as possible, and this is a dish towel, so like I would want the back to be as clean as possible. I'm just going to do a whipped back stitch for a few times. So that means I'm going underneath, so I'm just kind of tacking down the tail that I'm going to cut off. So I'm going to go underneath the thread. I'm not piercing the fabric at all. I'm just kind of looping it around, you know, 2-3 times. And then I'm going to cut off this excess and I'll grab my next color. All right, so I have my red. I'm going to show you how I do the knot once again. So I put the end of the thread up against my needle, wrap it around 3 times, and hold that between my index finger and my thumb. It is not, I'm not really pushing down, I'm just kind of holding it. And then I guide it all the way down the thread and it eventually tightens to create this knot. I cut off the excess. Okay, so I just wanted to change colors to show you how to do colors next to each other if that's something that you're curious about, kind of if you're a beginner. So still with the back stitch, this feather is going to be red, and so I'm going to come up right here and do the same back stitch that I just did. So come up, go back down, about the same distance again, come up right there on that line that you're following, go back down. All right, so something that's going to make this look as clean as possible is if you can come up, if it works, to come up in the same hole that you created with the other stitch. Like any intersection, try to come up and use the same hole. And go back down. I just think that makes it look cleaner. Something I try to do. Up. Down. And this is it. This is the back stitch. So especially with a design like this that has so many different colors, I'd probably recommend doing, you know, maybe one color first and then switching to another color. As you get more threads on the back, one thing I do, so if I were to jump from like here where it's going to end and go over here, if I had already done the body of the turkey, probably what I would do is do a few stitches of the whipped back stitch. Oops, sorry, you can't see. To tack it down along the back and just kind of move from point A to point B. I'll try to show you when I get to the bottom of this. It would be easier if I had the body of the turkey done. Okay. So last one right here. Okay, see, that's not perfect. I didn't go down the same exact hole. If that is going to bother you, which that would probably bother me, you can just take it out, re-thread it, and start right back over. Okay, so I got it back on my thread, and I just wasn't paying close enough attention. Oh, am I going back in the same exact hole? Here we go. Okay. And now, so say I want to come over here, I would just kind of loop it under here, loop it under here, and then start right there. But for now, I am just going to tie this off and start the name. So for names, I typically use the same exact back stitch as well. But sometimes I get specific questions about names and if they're different. So I just wanted to show you a little bit. So you're going to come up, go up and down just like you would. And I chose to do Luke's name because he does have kind of a decent amount of curves, but then also some straight lines. And so again, just kind of keep in mind keeping it a consistent size, but smaller during curves as well. So you do this all along. A few things to note on words. So see, just because of where I started, I wasn't sure exactly where the L would come down. That's absolutely something that you can go back and fix. So I'm just gonna go ahead and do that. I'll come right back up at the beginning of this stitch. It's a little bit difficult because my knot is right there. And just go ahead and connect that. Keep doing the L. And then like I said with the turkey, when the letters are connecting, you know, maybe it's a cursive font or something, I do think it makes it look just a little bit cleaner if when the letters connect, it uses like a similar intersection. So that down stitch right there I'm going to try to come up with this U and go down right in that hole. And then I'll use it again. Go up and down in that down stitch. But it's really the exact same. You're just following the lines throughout his name. And go up and down all throughout his name. And I'll go ahead and tie off so you can see the knot again and the whipped back stitch, and we will move on. Okay, so it's just, again, kind of a double knot up against the fabric as close as you can. And then I just kind of tack it down by going underneath the thread a few times. Tying off the excess. That's it. All right, I'm going to show you two different stitches for this flower, the whipped back stitch and the satin stitch. The whipped back stitch is one that I use if you want your line to look a little bit bolder, a little bit smoother. The satin stitch, honestly, I do not use that much, especially on clothing. If it's a larger design, like I would say this design is too large to do a satin stitch. This is probably small enough, this flower, and it does work for flower petals and things, but I don't know how great it holds up in the wash if it's on clothing, and I typically do toddler clothing. So just what I'm typically thinking of. But we're going to do a whipped back stitch first because it's just one step up from the back stitch. So we're going to do a back stitch real quick on one of these petals. All right, we finished the back stitch on this petal. So what we're going to do is come up really close to the inside or outside, doesn't really matter, but one side of the stitch where you just ended. So I'm going to come up, see how I'm just to the side and I'm as close as I can. Let me see if you can make sure you see that. So come up. And we are going to whip the thread around each of these stitches, not going through the fabric at all. So since I came up on the left side, I'm going to run my needle underneath the right side of the next thread. We're going back this direction. So I'm just going to run my needle and it's whipping around. So it's doing that, and then to the next thread, I'm going to do the same exact thing. And you just do that along all of your stitches. My needle's not going through the fabric at all. It's just right on top, going around all of these stitches. And it's just making a thicker, smoother line. Okay, and so your last stitch, I do typically go ahead and do this. Some people, you can just put your needle down right there, but I think for me, I like to go ahead and do the very last whip stitch right here. So everything is tight, and then I go down the very first hole. And go down, and then you tie it off. The satin stitch is how you make this solid. So it's a way to fill in. So what I'm going to do is come up right here and go down this direction. And then you can, if you want, come up right here again and go down to the side and kind of work your way. But in order to conserve thread, I'll show you how I'm going to go back and forth. so that the thread only shows on one side. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to find, you know, generally kind of the middle of the petal and come up and directly across the petal where I want it to go down, just go right down and pull. And so you could bring your needle up right here again and go down over here. But what I'm going to do is bring my needle up right here along the side of the petal and go down over here. And now since my thread is on like the base of the petal again, I'll come up over here, and I'm going to alternate sides just to kind of keep it consistent and make sure it looks as symmetrical as possible. Go down, up, and down. And since this is wider on the side of the petal, you absolutely can, you know, kind of use the same holes on the base petal side, and it'll just fill in. But again, I do think that this works on smaller designs. It's just quite a bit of thread to not be tacked down essentially, especially on a t-shirt. If you're framing it or something like that, I don't think it makes that big of a difference. And this is going to be my last one, and I'll tie off. So 2 different ways to do flower petals. Okay, moving on to the rainbow and the slightly more challenging stitches, but really not too complex. Both the chain stitch and the French knots. So I'll show you if you want to do a chain stitch, and people use chain stitch absolutely to do like words, especially if this was larger. I do think that a name needs to be a little bit larger for a chain stitch. You could use it for, you know, to outline a petal or something. It's going to make a thicker line, so it'll be bolder. It's also a way to fill in, especially if something has texture. So I will show you how to do just the outline of the rainbow, and then also if you wanted to fill in the rainbow, what that would look like with a chain stitch. And then we'll do some French knots for the clouds right here. So I will say, I have seen a couple of different ways to do chain stitch. This is how I do it. You come up the fabric, go right back down the same exact hole. And then I create a little bit of a loop. I decide how large I want my stitch to be, and I come back up. And then I just make sure that the loop is around my needle. The needle's coming through the loop, and I pull it. And it makes like a little chain. And then I'm going to go back down in the same exact hole again, just like I did, keeping a loop on the top, about the same distance. Make sure your needle's coming up through the loop. Pull and continue. So go down the same hole. Come up through the loop. And we're going to do this the whole top of the rainbow. You do want to make sure with the chain stitch that the loop stays even. Like you wouldn't, sometimes it can get twisted like this. And you want to make sure that it's going to be even like on both sides and lay flat. When you get to the end of the line of your chain stitch, so I just did the very last stitch of this line, I'm ready to either stop if I'm just going to do this outline or start over and do the fill. You just go right back down on the outside of the loop. So here's my loop. I came up the middle. I'm going to go in the same hole, but I'm on the outside of the loop. So it just kind of tacks it down, just like that. And then I am going to fill in, and you can choose to see if you want to do your chain stitch the opposite direction, or if you want to tie off over here and kind of start over, which is what I'm going to do. So doing the second line of the chain stitch, I'm going to come up right next to where my first line was. And obviously I don't have lines, but I'm just going to use this, the first line that I stitched, kind of as a guide. So I don't want to be right on top of my first line, but just kind of touching. And you do the same, oops, pulled my loop all the way through. There we go. You do the same stitch, just really close to it. What is going to make this look as neat as possible is making sure that on the second line, your stitches are about the same distance as the one right above it, if that's what works for the texture you're working with. So I'll come up right here, make sure my needle goes through the loop, and pull. Go right back in the same hole. Come up right next to the first hole. And pull. And you do this the whole way. Just fill it in. And then I'm going to go ahead and finish that off, because you can probably imagine what that looks like. So again, to finish off a chain stitch, you just go down on the outside of the loop and tack it down, just like that. And I'm actually going to show you the French knot with the same lavender thread, just to have a little bit more contrast from what I would typically do. It's like an ecru thread or white. So I'm going to come up. If I were to fill this in with French knots, it doesn't necessarily matter where you start. Maybe you start from right here, but you're not really like following the line of the clouds, unless that's the design you're going for and you're going to do French knots along the line of the clouds. But I would typically fill it in. So I'm just going to come up wherever, go up. And then with the French knot, it's a knot on top of the fabric, and then you're tacking it down. So you're going to hold the thread with your left hand and just kind of wrap it around the needle. I just wrapped it around 3 times. It's tight-ish, but it's not super, super tight. The more times that you wrap it around, the bigger knot it'll be. Usually I do 2 or 3, so it's just wrapped around the needle. And then I'm going to put my needle, it kind of moved on me. I'm going to put the needle down in the same hole that I just came up, still with the thread wrapped around it, and just kind of holding it with my left hand. Hold on. I had snagged the knot on the back, actually. So you want to avoid that. So I'm holding the thread with my left hand still, pulling the needle along the back, and then I can release, and there's my knot. And I'll do it again. So you come up, wrap the thread 2 or 3 times, Then I usually put my finger right here above where I just wrapped it, help guide it in the same hole. Take out the extra slack with my left hand and pull. This is how I typically dot eyes. If in a name, I usually just wrap it around 2 times for a name. But you can just fill it in, just like this. And that's a French knot. Those should be all of the kind of main stitches that I use. If you ordered a stencil from one of my kits, it is printed on water-soluble paper, and so I can go and put this in warm water. All of the designs are already at a decreased transparency, so you really shouldn't have an issue with any of the ink bleeding. I will say I typically wash it with warm water and then also throw it in the wash, just because I am typically stitching on clothing. And when I do throw it in the wash, I use a Shout color catcher just to grab any of the additional any of the additional ink. But really, I've made hundreds of shirts. I haven't had any issues with the bleeding, and so you shouldn't either. But just wanted to note that you do need to make sure it has a decreased transparency, which these do, and then wash with warm water in, under the sink or in a bowl or something like that, and you should be good to go.